and welcome to our panel on demystifying the missing middle. My name is Celia Bakita.
And I'm Wesley Reibling.
And we're the co-chairs of Jane's Walk. Also, while they're not here right now, I just wanted to give a shout out to our coordinators, Kate and Erica. These two are the ones who are behind the scenes doing all the groundwork to make the festival happen. They've done an incredible job this year, as I'm sure you're experiencing firsthand with day 2 of this year's festival.
Before we begin, we'd like to honor the land that we're on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Nishiabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis people. These treaties and other agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peacefully share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. We're all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We welcome and recognize the many nations of Indigenous people who presently live on this land, though who have spent time here and their ancestors on the land known as Turtle Island. We recognize and support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes. We also wanted to take the time before we jump into the panel to thank you for supporting Jane's Walk and for being here. So for those who don't know, Jane's Walk started in 2006 here in Toronto to honor Jane Jacobs, her spirit, and her teachings. Jane's Walk is all about community. At its core is the acknowledgement that the people make up the heartbeat of our cities. And by walking together, by sharing ideas with strangers, we can deepen connections, broaden perspectives, and generate a more inclusive, welcoming, resilient society.
And as you may know, or may not, we are a completely volunteer-run, donor-funded organization made up of passionate community builders like yourselves. We rely entirely on donations to make the festival happen each year. So if you would like if you like what you see this weekend and have some spare change or pocket change lying around, please donate. Every little bit helps and goes toward creating festivals in future years and events like today's.
Yes. Now, speaking of open dialogue and inclusive communities, I am very happy to introduce our Missing Middle panel. We all know that the housing situation in Toronto is challenging, to say the least. A family needs over $180,000 right now to purchase an average home, something that only 10% of families in Ontario are able to afford. And with housing being increasingly perceived as a commodity, it tends to leave the most desirable neighborhoods as enclaves for the wealthy and leads to deeply rooted generational and economic injustice. So today, we're hoping to discuss one potential solution to Toronto's housing crisis, the missing middle. And don't worry, we're going to break down exactly what this is, what it looks like, what it means through our incredible panelists today. So on this panel, you'll hear perspectives from all types of different folks: planners, non-planners, city officials, activists, renters, owners, and I'm very, very happy to pass it over to Shannon Holness, our moderator, who is a founding advisor of Progress Toronto and a planner at Process. She hails from Jane and Finch, is committed to social justice, and is passionate about empowering future generations. She recently completed her master's in urban planning from the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University, where she linked her lived experiences as a social housing resident with theory and wrote a compelling thesis centered on an analysis of community revitalizations all over the world. Wow, we are so excited to pass it over to you, Shannon, so take it away.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Cecilia. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited because we have a really, really esteemed panel who'll be walking us through the missing middle discussion and helping to further demystify it. Even though I'm a planner, I still struggle with all of the terminology that exists to describe the different challenges we have in our urban context and the different solutions. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from some experts on this as the missing middle as a solution, but also what are some of the challenges within that. So we're gonna nuance it a little bit today. I'm super proud to be moderating a panel with Sylvia Roberts, who is a devoted resident of Brampton. She has advocated on a range of issues in Brampton, with her having a special focus on housing and transportation policy, especially how these policies relate to marginalized communities such as international students. We are also honored to have Nama Blonder's professional expertise here. Nama's professional practice combines the disciplines of architecture, urban planning, and urban design to bring a deeper, more realistic understanding of how cities can address housing affordability and champion inclusive neighborhoods with more equitable access to housing. Her work has received numerous awards, including the Ontario Association of Architects Best Emerging Practice for 2022. Welcome. Next, I am proud to announce that we're joined by Deputy Mayor Anna Bailao. Deputy Mayor Anna Bailao serves as City Councillor for Ward 9, which is Davenport. She has been a member of Toronto City Council since 2010 and was re-elected in 2018. She is the chair of the Planning and Housing Committee and a member of the city's executive committee. She chairs the corporation's nominating panel and is also a member of the board of the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and Create-TO. Deputy Mayor Bailao also represents the City of Toronto at the Confederation of Canadian Municipalities, where she chairs the Social Economic Development Committee. And last but not least, we'd love to welcome Greg Lintern to the panel. Greg Lintern is Chief Planner and Executive Director of City Planning, Toronto. Greg is committed to making Toronto more livable, inclusive, and adapted for all people. His priorities include meaningfully responding to the housing affordability challenge, growing the transit network across the entire city, proactively planning complete and well-designed communities to support population and employment growth, integrating climate adaptation, and modernizing planning services. I think I can say this confidently, without them, we can't. We really need a diverse range of actors to help facilitate a broad range of change. I'm so looking forward to hearing from folks today over the next hour and a half. So let's kick it off with Greg. Can you let us know how we define the missing middle?
Sure, Shannon, and thank you for that introduction. It's great to be participating in Jane's Walks virtually. I know our staff are out actually doing a couple of them. There's one happening right now, actually, I think on Rogers Road, so that's pretty cool. And there was one this morning, and they're out on the ground talking about the missing middle, which is great for everyone in the conversation. I was just thinking, as you said, demystifying this. This really wasn't a conversation 5 years ago when I think about it. Like, it really, really has taken on an incredible amount of momentum. And many people, as you say, maybe don't have a complete grasp of maybe what we're talking about when they hear these terms. If you want to throw up that one slide that I sent you about, it's a graphic that shows the housing types in the city that people might see. And you can see by this graphic that really what we highlighted here are types of housing, whether they be a secondary suite in a house, whether they be a semi, a row house, a triplex, a fourplex, stacked townhouses, low-rise apartment buildings, everything kind of in between a single detached house that many of us might be familiar with and a mid-rise or a tall building. And what's interesting about this is that about 30% of Torontonians actually live in these forms of housing. So it's certainly not foreign to many people. And maybe you live in one, maybe you've got friends or family that lived in one. I remember I have lived in a converted house that used to have 3 units. I've lived in a triplex for a couple of years. So I've got some familiarity with what this means from my own lived experience. But one of the other aspects of missing is that it's not getting built as much as the other kinds of housing. About 1% of the new housing units that the city is achieving every year. We approve about 28,000 units a year, but about 1% is actually from the missing middle. And we know we have a great need and a great demand for what I might call ground-related housing, because people have different needs. Maybe they can live in a high rise or a mid rise at some point in their life. Maybe their interest is more around ground-related housing, and to be able to access ground-related housing in Toronto is really one of the goals. Like having more people have that option available to them, have that choice available to them through their life is part of this. So that's the missing middle. And as I said, it's a conversation that's really taken on a lot of momentum certainly in the last few years, but it wasn't prominent when you think back about 5 years ago.
Thanks, Greg. That's perfect. And you touched on some of the ways that it can alleviate some housing needs, different housing needs in terms of access to ground-related housing. Nam, I don't know if you want to jump in and maybe describe more ways that introducing more missing middle housing could help alleviate some of the challenges that characterize the housing crisis today.
Right. I want to tackle this question by sharing a personal story. My partner and I recently were in the search for family-friendly unit. Now you name it. Okay, what does it mean? But remember that we're both architects, so you can imagine the type of research we did to find our unit. And I remember my partner coming home and he says, I think we only have 5 buildings in the city that we can live, and that is large enough for a family. It's near transit. It's in the downtown or in an urban field. That's something that was very important to us. And I think the missing middle has the potential to solve exactly that. And I'm so happy that we started from the definition of what it is, the professional definition. But let's talk about the soft definition, because missing middle is also the middle of income and middle of demographics and things that are, the soft or the type of housing, right? We saw that illustration, and it's something between a house and a condo. And I say that because condo, of course, is just a form of ownership, but we say condo and we mean mid-rise and tall buildings in the city. So the missing middle is exactly that, right? And I think with more options, and remember, Toronto is the fastest growing city in North America. It's attracts talent from all over the world. As you can probably hear, I wasn't born in Canada, and Toronto is such an amazing city. We continue to grow, and we cannot grow. It's not a sustainable way to grow in a form of a single family on a single lot, right? It has to be more housing to welcome more neighbors to our neighborhoods. So that is exactly how the missing middle could do that, could release the pressure.
Great. And I think, I don't know, Deputy Mayor Balau or Sylvia, if you'd like to chime in on some of the ways that missing middle housing could help alleviate challenges.
Do you want to go first, Sylvia? I can jump in as well.
Oh, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, as you can probably tell, I'm on a little bit of an improvised setup because my camera and stuff fell. A webcam didn't work out. So currently I live in a townhouse. I have actually never lived in a purpose-built apartment. When I was really little, we lived in a single family home, an old Victorian that had been cut up into a whole bunch of units. And then later we moved into an old Victorian as single detached, and then a converted old farmhouse that had been all sorts of weird stuff. And now at this point, I'm living in a condo townhouse, and we're actually quite happy here. Some people would consider condo townhouses a form of missing middle. I wouldn't necessarily, because they're still fundamentally single family homes. I mean, I still have my own personal backyard. I have my own front door to walk out. So to me, I don't see how it's not just another single family home. But even that, in all too many parts of Toronto and the 905, townhouses are considered unacceptable. I was at Brampton's last planning meeting, and there were people complaining about how the houses being built next to them on 55-foot lots would destroy the character of the neighborhood because they were too dense. So what I've found is there's literally no such thing as gentle enough density to please some people. I think there were 50 people who showed up, or at least 50 people who signed a petition to complain about that, and a half dozen who delegated against it. In a bunch of places, like in Brampton, we have, I believe, last year, we approved more secondary units than the rest of the GTA combined, which is a lot. And our new official plan, our draft official plan, is actually looking at requiring 50% of new build housing to have, that's subject to subdivision control, to have secondary units built into them that are move-in ready when the unit is actually being delivered. So that's going to be a key part of our housing supply. In places like Toronto, the cost of construction for high-rises is so high that the city can mandate a 3-bedroom unit be built, but the reality is the cost is so high that it's still not going to be affordable for a family, and what you're going to get instead is a somewhat cramped 3-bedroom unit that is occupied by roommates. It's missing middle because you can do it with low-rise wood frame construction, can actually be done so the construction cost is low enough. You can build family-sized units again. Because I'm sorry, but an 800 square foot 3-bedroom unit is not family-sized. We've seen some of that stuff showing up in Toronto. It's like 800 square feet. It's not family sized.
So some of the stuff that Sylvia is mentioning are some of the supply challenges, and also some of the ways that sometimes what is called zoning, the minimum requirements for a property or for a room, those are things the city can mandate. Those kind of brush up against some of the needs of families, and maybe present barriers for constructing units faster or affordably. So those are some of the challenges that I hear, Sylvia, coming out of your response there. I think it's great that so many of our panelists are able to relate their lived experience to the missing middle and some of the ways that it can contribute to accessible housing opportunities, can contribute to family style living, but there are those limitations around the cost of construction and what is a minimum requirement for housing to be built in the Greater Toronto area. So really appreciate these responses.
Before we move into that, can I just make one more comment? Because I think
of course
Brett talked about the build forum. I think there's Nama talked about the income and how it affects that. Sylvia talked about already some of the obstacles. This also has a huge impact on the kind of neighborhoods that we're building. And let me give you the example of the neighborhood that I live in and that I represent. It was a working class neighborhood that actually allows for some of these multiplexes. And many years ago, they were being built. And now we're actually seeing more and more of these houses that had 2-3 units being bought and actually turned into single family homes because of gentrification and so on. So while you have some of these areas where some of this is allowed, because it's not an easy thing to do, and because of the housing situation is not getting done as much as possible. And then you have other parts of the city where you're not allowed as well. But what you're by not making it easy, by not making it allowable, by not bringing some of that missing middle that really in many of our neighborhoods in the city was built 30 years ago, you are losing a lot of that working class, middle class in a lot of our neighborhoods. What we're talking about is we're pushing a lot of the people that lived in our neighborhoods out of our neighborhoods. And so if you come to Davenport, which I learned recently is the community that has the most missing middle, you hear a lot of people saying, you know, I wouldn't be able to afford to buy my house today. My kids cannot live in here. And that's why people get excited about laneway housing and garden suites and multiplexes, because we're starting to see people having a bit of a shift moving into intergenerational housing and finding solutions to make it affordable to be kept in their community. So this is going to have and can have an impact on the affordability of housing, and consequentially will have a huge impact on the kind of communities and the equity and the kind of inclusive communities that we'll have in the city as well.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Shan, what I like to, when I think about this, I think about the history of the city, and Deputy Mayor Bailau mentioned the structure and the look and the feel of Davenport, right? And people are very familiar maybe with two kinds of city in Toronto. One is the older, pre-World War II city that was not originally constructed as much around the car. And this isn't an anti-car comment. This is just the way it happened. And post World War II, suburban expansion, we have a different auto-centered idea of urban planning in North America. Separation of land uses, sprawl, people sometimes call it. And it's kind of an interesting point that we're at, because those areas of the city are now 70 or 80 years old. Like they're approaching a point in time where renewal and change is coming to the suburbs. And it's kind of an inflection point. What is going to happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years? What are these areas going to be like? We talk about 2051 because we're growing the population by at least 700,000 people by 2051. Who's going to live in these areas? Are they going to be able to afford it? How are these areas going to transform? And I think you're beginning to see a lot of transformation in the suburbs already, with large plaza sites being redeveloped, with new transit networks being laid down, which is all very exciting. But we have to ask ourselves what's going to be happening in the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. The neighborhoods in the old part of the city have evolved. They have evolved. Many of those neighborhoods were built originally as single detached housing that were converted into multiple unit dwelling houses. They've kind of gone back and forth to accommodate housing need over time. And I would think that that is the type of evolution that is gradually going to come to the rest of the city. But we have to think about 2051 and what kind of outcomes, like what is this city going to be like, and who is going to live here, be able to afford to live here? Is it going to be built in a climate adaptive way? Will it include or exclude people of different means? And that's kind of what motivates me as a planner in looking at the way that zoning and other regulations might frustrate or limit the imagination and the creativity that we want to bring to solving some of the housing challenges. So in a way, it's, you're asking people to think very long term here. But there's an immediate concern, and we've talked about this a lot in our conversations with people. There's an immediate concern. Where are my kids going to live right now? Where are my employees going to live right now? Where are my friends and family going to live right now? Like, there's a pressing, and it kind of connects the future to the current in my mind, which is very interesting.
Awesome. Thank you all for your perspectives. What I'm hearing kind of come out as a strong thread is, some of the solutions can fall short in some ways, where we're having big equities come up in numerous times from a few panelists so far. And that is also that's also an area where the missing middle can fall short as a solution. So when we think about who wins and loses in Toronto's current housing market, how might the missing middle concept address that or fall short? And maybe thinking through that in a suburban lens as well. We can start with you, Sylvia, to kind of guide us through some of those challenges.
So Brampton is fun because a majority of our housing stock is single detached. And so a number of years back, if you've been in Brampton, you will have heard about the Big Blue House, which was, because our rules are actually give you a fairly large building envelope, Someone had torn down a house and got a building permit for, like, I think the neighborhood is like bungalows, building a 4,000 square foot house. And someone had screwed up on the paperwork and granted it, even though it didn't meet some of the setback requirements. And so the foundation had been laid and had already been going above grade before that. And there was a big challenge. And in the result, as a result of the fight about that, about trying to get that building destroyed before it could be built, the city put in a mature neighborhood zoning, which was kind of mature neighborhood overlay in our official plan and zoning stuff, which was to basically try to replicate Toronto's mature neighborhood stuff. And that has caused a lot of stalling out. We haven't really been able to do that. So at this point, pretty much all of our development is going on plaza sites. We still have lots of underutilized plazas, and the city is allowing relatively high density stuff on them. So our land is still quite cheap, which runs into issues because inclusionary zoning to get 5% doesn't work if land is under 5% of the cost of the total structure to build, because you're asking for them to have a negative cost to it. And people don't want stuff built next to them. They want exactly what was there. So in like Mississauga, for example, a convent, so a community of a religious sister, Catholic religious order in Mississauga, a bunch of their members had started getting up there in years. And so I think the site had already sort of had like some senior housing on site, and they wanted to build a 6-story thing. And because they needed the size to make it work out. And a whole bunch of neighborhood residents came out saying, this will destroy the character of the neighborhood. Also, just because it's senior housing, we still think that there's gonna be students living there. And the weirdest thing was the people who seemed to hate on the senior housing the most all seem like they're well into retirement age. So it's, even the people you think would benefit, there's just such a huge status quo bias against stuff that it causes issues. So my grandmother lives in Brampton. We picked a place near her. And so she'd been living in a 2-story single detached house. And so a building got built. Emeka built a place. So she has senior independent living, and she downsized and was able to move there. But, and a bunch of people from the neighborhood did too. But I think that was controversial, and like someone tried to build a unit with a building with like 90 units, and there were a dozen applications against it. It's still stuck in limbo because it's a weird site. There are so many issues with trying to build stuff that I've tried looking at the constraints in Brampton zoning bylaw. And so the amount of different constraints, first there's just the zoning for a single detached unit, but then there's different rules. So you might have floor space index, and then you've got side setbacks and front setbacks. And like the front setbacks are far enough from the street because they're designed to have parking in front of it. And then there's the rear setbacks for a yard, and they don't want to budge on that. And the amount of constraints means it's actually very difficult to figure stuff out. And then you can run into stuff like site plan control and all of this kind of stuff. And then you have,
if I may just pause you for a second. Are you saying that sometimes when development is proposed that will alter, maybe significantly or even in a minor way, how a property looks right now, there are some ways that the city may interfere in that change, or that residents in the local community may oppose those changes, and so that is a negative outcome for ways to increase the stock of missing middle housing? Is that where you're heading?
Yeah. So Brampton needs to increase the amount of housing it's building by 5x. It needs to actually build 5 times as much housing as it is currently building in order to keep pace with the population.
Okay. So
it's impossible for a planning department to scale that fast. The amount of people you need for inspecting permits and because we have zoned everything in such a way that the only thing permitted by that is what is currently there, and maybe you can get a patio or bump out the building by 300 square feet. That means every single application takes a huge amount of work, and it just messes up the whole process. More stuff needs to be done by right. So I've sent some images of like older stuff that was built by right in Brampton, and a bunch of it's actually decent stuff.
So I don't know if you want to take a moment to look at those images, but I think the kernel in what Sylvia's saying is that, and back to the question is, you know, when these decisions are made to kind of maintain what exists currently, and there are some challenges that the city or other residents may have on a proposed change to a property, there can be that means that there's less housing being added to the housing stock, which means less people will be able to be housed. And I think that's kind of where we're going with this. I don't know if others on the panel want to chime in and maybe weigh in with their experiences and how they've seen some of these challenges to development applications for missing middle housing kind of create gaps in the housing market, which I think is what we're talking about today.
Well, I think probably Greg he will expand on what I say because he's the expert on this. But what we clearly see in Toronto is that we have all the growth happening in a very limited amount of space of the city. And we know that land costs in our city have a huge impact on the price of housing. So when you have about this much growth happening in, you know, the last 30 years, we had 25% increase in our population in basically very small part of the land, because most of the land is single family homes. And then you have neighborhoods like mine that has population decreases because families are smaller, because triplexes are being turned into single family homes because they cost $1.2 million. And so the pool of people that can afford them are smaller. So what we're trying to say is, can we start going into those neighborhoods and actually create more housing? Because we know the population is increasing. Can we take advantage of that land in a sensible way? Because, I mean, through the work that we're doing with the expanding housing options, we're very much looking at what does the envelope look like? And you know, can we accommodate more housing in there? And we're seeing that we can accommodate more families, more housing in that area, in areas that is currently having population decrease. And all these things will have an impact on the price. So that's why you bring diversity into neighborhoods, because like I said, you have a $1.2 million home, but if you have, you know, that home now being done into 4 apartments, you know, if you have 4 families coming together and buying that house and dividing it, it reduces. Now, I want to mention this because a lot of people say, well, but these things are not really affordable. Like I fought hard on laneway housing. I led that process, and Greg and I, that's the first thing we hear, right, when we go to anything is like, well, that's not really affordable. Of course not. With the construction costs that we have nowadays, you don't build a laneway housing for probably less than $400,000. But it's a lot cheaper than anything that is being built in the community. And it's either creating a rental unit or a unit for somebody to afford it at that price that probably wouldn't be able to afford to live in that community. So it's bringing different kinds of people into the neighborhood. Actually, to be honest with you, it's not even different. In my community, it's not even different. It's the people that have been here for 40 years that today they can't afford to be here. That's the reality. It's the people that are here that we're saying, okay, if I want my kid to be in here, this is a good option. Now, it doesn't create the deep affordable housing. I do a lot of work on housing, and I often say this: listen, in our housing crisis, you can't fund our way out of this, and you can't build our way out of this. These solutions, the market will never produce, for example, supportive housing, the deep affordable supportive housing with the support. They will never support it. We need governments to make the investments and to do that. Now, changes in the zoning like this can facilitate some of our nonprofits as well to create some of those housing as well. But we always have to understand that we need governments to invest in housing, but that money should be targeted to create that deeper affordability, to take care of the most vulnerable. Market solutions like this that we're talking about, the missing middle, the zoning bylaws, all these changes should be able to take care of the housing continuum for our workforce housing, for that more of that side of the housing spectrum. We should be able to deal with some of those levels of affordability with some of these zoning changes and some of these tools, which is this is a tool in the toolbox of the housing continuum.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, because I was going to mention the toolkit analogy, and we talk, and I think Sylvia mentioned the as of right zoning, and maybe Naomi can expand on this, but the beauty of having more permissive as of right zoning, again, within the same general scale that you see now in neighborhoods, because I think the city will always be made up of low, medium, and high rise scale. But what, I sometimes use the analogy of, can we get a little bit more juice out of this orange, or in this case, the yellow belt? Can we make it perform better for people? And if you carve up the box, like the box that exists on any lot right now has a length, a width, and a height, and setbacks and other zoning requirements. But what if you inside that box, if there's one unit that's let's say it's 8,000 square foot McMansion or monster house that many people see popping up in the neighborhoods, or maybe it's 2,000 square foot, or if it's smaller, maybe it's 1,000 square foot, but you're getting grade related housing out of it. You're getting something that might be very accessible to local services, that maybe those local services are crying out for more people because the population in those neighborhoods has actually been going down. Maybe the local retail strip needs more shoppers and more people to serve. It is a market-driven proposition to make the zoning more permissive. This is not capital A affordable housing, as Deputy Mayor said, but it does broaden the suite of choices that people have. And going back to my earlier point, it changes the narrative about what neighborhoods are about and who they are for. And I think this is the longer term view that people are beginning to talk more and more about is, as I said earlier, are my employees going to be able to work in Toronto, or they're going to have a long commute? Yeah, hybrid is something new, and people will do that, but they're making choices now to move all over the place. Do we want to stay in that game? Immigration into Ontario and Canada and Toronto has been the driving force behind our population growth. If not for immigration, our population growth would be non-existent. In fact, our decline would be palpable, I think. So we need to find places for people to live, for our economic competitiveness, to bring more housing choices for, especially again, for people who are just starting out or want to come through their extended family relationships. Naomi, you want to chime in?
Oh, yeah. So my sister's getting married soon, and she's going to want to start a family. And one of the things Toronto has a huge excess of is school spaces. Because the city has been concentrating all of the growth in a couple areas, there's a couple areas that desperately need schools. And then there's a large swath of the city where TDSB is like, I beg of you, please, for the love of God, we need children here, because they can't close the schools because of provincial rules, but also many of the schools are below 50% capacity. I think TDSB, it was something like 24 secondary schools are below half occupancy. It's just absolutely astounding. And so people are like, well, what about all these people who are living here? It's a case of TDSB, I'm pretty sure, gets paid on the number of students. And so they have all of these older buildings that are half empty that they can't close. And the population of children is not increasing. From what I understand, it's going down, and they're all moving to London. My mind is... Okay, let me phrase it this way. London built a new school, and the day it opened, it was at 130% capacity because they didn't realize just the gigantic number of students children coming in from Toronto. Toronto is so large that it doesn't take a huge percentage of people moving from Toronto to just completely overwhelming different cities' capacity. So it's the 416 suburbs filled up, and then the 905 suburbs filled up, and then Kitchener started to run into issues, and now it's London, and at this point, Sarnia is net gaining population from Toronto.
So
Sarnia.
there's clearly an interdependence of, our housing supply and who lives in the communities and the resources and services and how they become allocated in our neighborhoods, which, our communities are certainly like an 8 to 80 community. You'd have where people who are 8 years old or 80 years old are able to live in place and grow in place. There's an ability for them to benefit from some of the resources and services that are available in their neighborhood. That's an interesting point. I don't know if Nama, if you have any divergent points.
I'm not I'm not a school expert. I'm trying to be very careful and stick to what I do know. And Sylvia, you mentioned the family size unit you gave the example of the 800 square feet, and Deputy Mayor Balau also mentioned units for families, and I want to make a comment on that because it's not about the size. Because by the way, I saw 1,300 square feet units that are shitty. So it's really not about size. It's about, and the city had, back in 2017, they introduced the Growing Up design guidelines, raising or planning for children in new vertical communities. And now I feel like we start seeing the outcome of that, because one of the design guidelines were to increase larger units in new developments of 20 units or more, which is not at all the missing middle. But it just shows you how policy make the changes, because now 5 years after, we start seeing larger units and more family-friendly units introduced into the market, something that 5 years ago wasn't at all the case. So I think, when we talk about affordability and I believe we're going to touch on government and all of that, what can be done, it's exactly that. It's changes in the framework of what are the rules of the game that we're playing here. And I think, also going back to that study, it also said that it's not just about size. It has, the unit, the building, and the neighborhood. It means that everything is a system and infrastructure of what it means to have a family-friendly city. So I think that's very, very important. And the missing middle for me absolutely ties into that discussion. It's about the neighborhood and about having my needs met in those three structures of policy. So now seeing the missing middle policy coming to a change, and a massive change, a huge transformation. I had a friend, he's been a planner in the city for over 20 years, and he told me, you kind of take it for granted, because I moved to Toronto only 8 years ago. 5 years ago, the discussion around missing middle just started. And he said, 20 years ago, just thinking about it was insane, a dream. No one even thought there was something wrong in the system. So now that we are having this discussion and I am able to speak to the public about it, it's really unbelievable in that sense.
Right. And I think a lot of the conversation was definitely spurred by conversations around exclusionary zoning and what uses were not permitted in communities and why. And then we hear a lot of Sylvia's comments around the opposition to introducing new housing in what are mature or stable communities where changes are not allowed to be made because the official plan says that's not where growth is permitted in our cities. And so there becomes a question of who has the right to live in that community. We have people who are everyday citizens who get to dictate that, and sometimes the impetus or the rationale behind their opposition is sometimes around not wanting to live in certain multicultural communities, introducing other cultures to their neighborhood, or living with others who may be living below a certain income level or income bracket. So there's a lot of that question of characters bound up in so much very challenging and hard stuff that we as a city and as civic people who are interested in facilitating the public good really need to overcome in order for this missing middle to be equitable. And as a racialized person, as somebody who understands that there is housing discrimination, it is challenging to sometimes hear the missing middle as a solution when we know that that does kind of put the power into the hands of people who probably didn't want to live near a triplex or something like that, you know? So I think that there is a lot of interesting questions around why we're having this discussion today. Who was the one who kind of brought these questions forward? A lot of racialized communities. And really, I know I come from a revitalization neighborhood, and I think why my community had to be bulldozed, why couldn't we challenge or disturb a stable community instead? So there are a little bit of questions I have just coming from my perspective. But we do also have to talk about the responsibilities of the municipal and provincial governments. Now, I think your comments are kind of allowing us to go further into that space. What are the responsibilities of the municipal government in tackling affordability issues? How does the missing middle help municipalities overcome some of those challenges?
Well, obviously everything I said is my personal opinion, but this answer is extremely and let's again define the boundaries of this answer. Is not about deeply affordable housing, that I do believe it's not. The private sector will will never do that. So I want to frame the answer by saying that it's affordability. It's not affordable housing in the sense of deeply affordable housing, but housing affordability, meaning that generations and future generations will have access to housing. And with that, I personally don't believe we need to look up to the government to solve our problems. I might be radical here, but I do believe the private sector is the best player to provide housing because they do it fast. They do it with, they're very bottom line driven, and they are capable of doing it. And in Canada, the private sector is the player that provides housing. So with that, I do believe that the government, I want to see more partnerships. And one recent example that we had was Housing Now. Now, Housing Now, again, was meant to provide more affordable housing by the definition that I mentioned that we're not covering, that my answer doesn't cover. But there is room for partnership and making the rules, again, the rules of the game, to allow for more players and make it more competitive. And then the private sector will know how to act. So I am not a developer. I'm an architect. I'm an urban planner. But I do believe that there is so much room for creativity when it comes to, so not necessarily provided by the government. I don't think and I hear that a lot from communities. So I think that's something that we need to address. It's not the government job to tackle that. And I hear, why can't it be 4 stories when it's a site that is, steps away from transit? So definitely not the right move. So generally speaking, and I'm sure I'm interested to hear what my fellow panelists here are thinking, but I believe it's about defining the rules that will allow some more creativity by the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, in Ontario, it's a rights-based system planning. So provincial policy is written up by the province, and the municipalities are creatures of the province, and we implement. And our decisions have to be consistent with that policy that comes from the province about planning our cities and towns. And the city, I think, has been in the forefront of often developing creative policy and creative ideas, and actually sending them the other way up to Queen's Park to inspire policy change. Back in the 80s, the ideas around reurbanizing our avenues, both at the metropolitan level and at the City of Toronto level, and other ideas, environmental leadership. Our Toronto Green Standard shows a lot of leadership. And I think this is another area where we're showing leadership. bringing forward policy that makes, as of right, secondary suites, laneway suites, garden suites recently, and the discussion that we're currently having around multiplex and other forms of missing middle housing. It's what's been an interesting part of this journey recently is the engagement that we've been undertaking, because we have tried to very deliberately and consciously be aware of the depending on your perspective, the exclusionary or inclusionary part of the conversation, and deliberately designing engagement processes that reach out to different people who have felt that they have not been part of the conversation, or have not been heard, who would not have access to policymakers. Online, the coincidence, if you will, of the pandemic happening at the same time with this conversation, all the virtual engagement we've had, but surveys, thousands and thousands of responses to surveys that we've never seen before on this topic, and the amount of interest in getting after this conversation. Different platforms. We were on Twitter Space the other night. We've been on Reddit. We did old-fashioned door-to-door surveys. I think we started it in March 2020, just as the pandemic hit. So we're trying to kind of broaden the conversation, understanding that, as you said, Shannon, that people have not been feel like they've been part of, and have not been part of the decision making and the policy making that goes on both at the city level and the provincial level. And it's really important to make sure that this conversation includes those people.
I would say that we're actually having quite a bit of a shift in who's playing in the housing game in terms of governments. If you look back at the history, most of the housing policy and housing investments had been done by the federal and provincial government, from programs from after World War II to social housing that was even used to be managed by the provincial government until the 90s, when it was downloaded to the City of Toronto. So all that shifted to the City of Toronto. I must say, when I was first elected, I felt that there was still a lot of reluctancy in accepting the responsibility of being more hands-on with regards to that kind of housing. We had Toronto Community Housing, but it was this corporation over here that really was downloaded on us, but they should really take care of themselves, and so be it. Yeah, they have a huge backlog, but they should take care of it. We should keep asking the province and the feds for money. And so I think there's been a huge shift. But I think in the City of Toronto, I think the city acknowledged that it's like, okay, we are in the game of housing. It got downloaded. We need to work with the other three orders of government. But I think that also there's been a lot of recognition that a lot of these planning policies, which were guided by the Planning Act, when we start now reflecting in a lot of the planning policies, there has been a lot of issues that have been overlooked, and there has been exclusionary policies, and this has been a policy that has favored certain people over others. Let's be very blunt. And I think there's a bigger awareness of that. I know that at least at the city, I feel like we're doing, as Greg said, our consultations from Indigenous communities, to getting other voices at the table, to hear how this is going to affect, really, because I think everybody's recognizing the way that things were done, and there was a lot of people being left out, and inequities are growing in our city, and housing is key of that growth. If we don't tackle this issue, I say this is foundational, right, for the opportunities that our residents are going to have. And if we don't tackle this issue, the inequities are going to keep growing. And like I said, I think that in a certain markets, a lot of these policies have a huge impact. In the housing spectrum, the policies around the zoning, around how we make sure that these neighborhoods are done in a way that allow the opportunity for different kind of people to live, for different kind of people to get into the ownership, that we impact this. So I think that governments do have a role to play, and that equity lens needs to be very carefully looked at, because all these policies have a huge impact. I mean, from all the way from allowing rooming houses and how we manage rooming houses in our city, all the way to, you know, the growing up guidelines. These are all, you know, tools and policies that will shape who lives in this city and how we live in this city. And I think we have that responsibility to do that. I think, you know, a lot of people were and are pushing the provincial government, for example, to end exclusionary zoning. I'm happy to hear lots of parties now in the election talking about it. Yeah. But I also feel very proud that we initiated that work in the city of Toronto, that we didn't wait for them to come through, that, you know, Greg's team has been working on it now for over a year on this work, and speaking with communities and having these kinds of conversations, and really people feeling how it will touch their lives. You know, I always find effective when we go into the communities and connect with people on how changing these policies, which sometimes for people that are not doing planning every day seems so abstract. It's like, oh my God, I don't know, I don't want 4 apartments beside me. But how it might touch their lives and impact their kids and impacts their families. And that might mean that they'll be able to take care of their parents, you know, much closer to them, or have their kids live close by. And I think that is really powerful. And I'm hoping that over the next few months we can have that real conversation here in the city of Toronto and have real change happening as well.
Hello. So I've actually been looking at, like, how do you deliver housing? Brampton, because it's still in the greenfield stages of development, we're still seeing applications for 1,200 units, predominantly in single family homes, whether that's detached to townhouses. And as someone who'd been looking into planning, my curiosity was, how does a planning department go through that? And they go through that many buildings? And the answer is that a builder doesn't actually put in unique building plans for every single one. It's that they come up with like 5 different basic building plans, and it's like, okay, this one's mirrored. And so they get the base ones approved, and then the planning departments only need to look at like the modifications to it, instead of needing to treat every single one as a separate thing. And so while it's currently done that the plans belong to the developers, there's no reason in particular why a city or a group of cities couldn't come together, have an architectural design competition. And it's like, yeah, hi, we want 10 designs for 4plexes, and we will have what we're offering $1 million prize to it, and you'll get a license fee of $10,000 for every time it's licensed. And I think you get lots of architects who would be up for that. Kelowna in BC did something like that. They didn't offer that kind of prize money, but then they discontinued because they're building too much housing. People are like, oh no, these buildings all look the same. It's like, we're literally building subdivisions of houses that are off only a handful of plans. This doesn't seem like an issue. But also, given Ontario's housing crisis, a situation where the cities are like, hey, we need to take a step back. We're building too many units. That is a better problem to have than what we have now. In Brampton, it's caused all sorts of horrible things. It's, especially for the international student population, the housing crisis has caused housing prices to go vastly beyond what people can possibly afford. And so a lot of young, vulnerable women are getting caught up in trafficking. And we don't want to talk about this. It's like, that's not really housing, but this is a consequence of how we plan and how we've always been planning. The origin of single family homes, why Toronto had the pushback and why it was put in place, is because fundamentally, when it was put in place, the idea was a woman's life consists of being owned by men. When she is born, she's the property of her husband, of her father, and then she'll be married, and then she'll be property of her husband. And that is the natural state of woman. And as such, it is a danger to society to have single women exist. And that is why the governments took steps in order to prevent apartments and stuff, because they allowed women to be independent. when we continue to push, it's basically we're still having patriarchal outcomes of policies that were put in place for literally patriarchal purposes. 100 years ago, the idea of patriarchy existing was not a controversy. It was whether it was moral, and the general position of society was, yes, it's moral, it's ordained by God, just read Genesis.
Right. So there are definitely some big challenges in the housing market as a consequence of that, which the missing middle can allow people of different gender expressions to be able to kind of live independently, and really truly live the promise of the city, which is to have that independence, and autonomy over yourself and agency and the right to your own space, and ability to express yourself. All interesting points, and I'm so sorry that we have to close the panel section of the discussion. There are lots of really cool points about the opportunities that missing middle housing could present for families, accessibility outcomes that could be possible as well, some of the challenges around it, opposition, and the interdependence of resources in the community when it comes to the housing begetting, more resources and services in the neighborhood. So it's very interesting. I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, so maybe we'll turn to some of those. So we have a question from Allison. Allison asks, where do rooming houses fit in the missing middle discussion? Does not see them in Greg's graphic of housing options.
Well, just to be brief, I think we dealt with the multi-tenant housing, which is what we call it in the City of Toronto, through a separate exercise. I think the relationship to missing middle is that it could take place in a house form building, and typically multi-tenant housing has taken place. When you think of the larger, for example, larger homes that were historically built maybe as one unit in Parkdale, and then over the years have been converted to multi-tenant houses or converted houses with different units in them. We kind of differentiate between a room, which will have either its own cooking or washroom facilities, but not both, and a unit, a self-contained unit, which would have both. But in the city, we have buildings that have a mix and a blend. But that's really the difference. From a land use point of view, it's pretty similar. But there is a whole regulatory issue with multi-tenant houses around the impacts that they have and the services that they need that are slightly different. So we've also always had a regulatory regime with multi-tenant houses or rooming houses that we have not had with other kinds of housing.
Thanks, Greg. I don't know if others want to chime in there.
Brampton has a lot of them.
Oh. Sorry, I'll just add that when we did the last report, what we did was actually a human rights review of the issue, and we actually had a consultant, human rights, to put that human right lens. And so we had not only the land use aspect of it and the MLS, but the housing secretary. How do we support? Because they're here. It's not like we need to build them. The issue is that there's actually a lot of issues with a lot that are existing. The vulnerability of the tenants that are in some of those illegal rooming houses, how to make them legal, how to take care of those that already exist and that are there. So there was a full package and recommendations, and the work continues. As people that are probably watching us, we weren't able to get the support yet. I'm hopefully that eventually we'll get there, but there's a lot of good work. I think that, may I say, right, Greg? May I say, there's a lot of good work that was done by our staff on that report, and there was a really fulsome set of recommendations to get it done.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Allison, which asks, what...
Can I address that a little bit?
Sure, go ahead.
Brampton actually has a gigantic number of rooming houses. They, in the past 5 years, they've gone from nowhere to basically everywhere except for the Toronto Core Rural Estate, which is houses that are like 5,000 square feet on 2-acre lots. But pretty much everywhere else in the city, if there's housing, there's now multi-tenant housing. And it's because Ontario's population growth is overwhelmingly being driven not by immigration, but by net non-permanent residents who are overwhelmingly international students. And Canada, in order to increase its supply of international students, has gone far beyond just like the upper class in developing countries into more like the middle class. And many of these people, they're middle class for developing countries, or maybe even upper middle class. But by Canadian standards, they don't have very much money, and they need this kind of housing. To have it illegal just means that those people are living in extremely overcrowded situations and are extremely vulnerable. We have had a big issue in Brampton where landlords are extorting sex from young women who are living there. So when a city decides that it doesn't want to expand multi-tenant housing, what they're effectively saying that they're okay with young women being trafficked and violated by landlords. It's necessary to legalize them, and the provincial government should be going in and forcing cities to legalize them because they're an essential component of housing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we do have another question. We have a few more. One question from Allison again. Thanks, Allison. If only 1% of the current approvals in Toronto are for missing middle housing, with the new tools, what is the city's goal? Is it 2%, 3%?
It's how about more than 1%? But it's a great question. And I do have a number that relates to a report that we did last year on housing turnover. And there is a normal amount of turnover that happens in the city when people age out of their current housing situation and they move on. And those houses are bought and sold, and new families moved in, or new households move in. I would expect that natural turnover that we've seen over the years might slow down as more people choose to age in place. And we did an analysis last year and did a report to Deputy Mayor's Committee, and we have a growth target for the city of a minimum of 700,000 people, and that is related to types of housing and housing need. So not just the number of units, but the kinds of units that we need. And that report identified that we actually need to increase the number of ground-related units. And that relates to the fact that everybody's seen the cranes and you've seen the apartment buildings being built, but you don't see the ground-related units. There are some, as I said, not that many. But what's really important here, to your question, Allison, is about the goal that we need to set. And in our new official plan review that's being undertaken, I think it's like 70 or 80,000 units of ground-related units that we are going to need to build, which really means about 2,200 units a year that we need to start building in ground-related housing. The only way we're going to be able to do that is to improve the housing options in neighborhoods by changing the zoning. So there's a direct line back to complying with provincial policy and changing the rules in Toronto to achieve the needs that people have for ground-related housing. So it's a great question.
Thank you. I don't know if others want to chime in, but we do have a good question from Vince here.
It's a case of a design competition to have pre-approved building plans, so that someone could just say, there's a catalog of designs that the city of Toronto has gone through, and someone's like, I want to use this house, I want to use this design, and she's like, okay, what's the positioning of it? Just show us the grading. Yep, there's sewer capacity, there's school space, go off. And that would streamline it in a way that would make it much easier for the city of Toronto to actually go through it. Because it's not just that Toronto that needs to do it. It's if you expand and have other cities able to go in, because of how relatively standardized the OBC is, it could be extremely useful for across the entire province.
So that maybe relates to Vince's question about what can we do to incentivize missing middle housing instead of single family homes. Nama, would that be a solution that, as an architect?
We don't need to do anything. It's such an amazing change in our system that we don't need to do anything. We don't need to create an artificial incentives in order to see more of it. You know, and I saw another question that I lost it. But anyway, no one, you know, in the missing middle, you know, it's a very North American thing, right? Like outside of North America, the middle is not missing, just to be very clear. So when you go to, and let's bring it back home, when you go to, let's say, Montreal, no one says, it's a horrible city, streets are ugly. No, it's a beautiful urban space, right? And most of, I don't know about most of Montreal, but the places I've been to, the neighborhoods that I've been to, are definitely built out of 3 to 4 stories, walk-ups. You see that each of them houses more than one family. It's like very clear, and it's yet a very beautiful urban environment. So the incentive is that's the core essence of the missing middle when it will be permitted, and it's, you know, in baby steps, but we don't need incentives. I want to see how what's the opposite of incentives for building more single family houses steps away from transit. I think that's not the way to do good city building. So yeah, just for that question.
Maybe I'll just add, and I know we've all been not very contrarian with each other this afternoon, so I'll take one. I'll mention one challenge, which will be, and we've done some work with the Urban Land Institute to look at the financial feasibility. And sometimes zoning is important, but it's not enough. And there are costs and charges, and it's good that we're not maybe including the land value in the proposition. So that's a big cost of housing that wouldn't necessarily be in the mix, but there are still other expenses and charges and time to design and get permits and all of those things. So whatever we can do to make that easier for people, I think is important. Construction, and I'm not an expert in it, but when we get more into modular construction, when we get into approaches that could be repeated over and over, and kind of, we call this session demystifying, but part of it is demystifying and not having bespoke processes every time, but something that works for more people in a more efficient manner. But I still think there will be, especially as this becomes something that more people might choose to look at, we have a very inflated housing market in Toronto. People are still going to build monster houses. We're not talking about taking that away, but we are talking about changing the story so that somebody might choose to build a multiplex, or somebody might choose to add a unit to an existing house instead of tearing it down, and changing the conversation about the options that people have for their property. Over time, one would expect it to be normalized, and people have a different way of looking at this. But I think in this transition that we're going to experience, or that we already are experiencing, because people are building these things already, they're building laneway, they're doing some multiplexes, but we are still net losing units in our neighborhoods. It's still contracting, and we have to kind of bend that back and head in the other direction to take full advantage, I think, of this opportunity.
If I could just add one thing, because I think I'm in between the two, but I do think that we need to take some action in this area. And I agree that, yes, we're still going to have the 4,000 square feet home. But right now, that 4,000 square feet comes to City Hall, gets a permit, doesn't pay any development charges, even though they're having huge costs to the City of Toronto, to the neighborhoods, because we need to build housing, and we're not going to be building in that neighborhood that might be very close to transit, so we have to invest in other infrastructure. And what we're charging is actually somebody that comes in and builds a fourplex. So I think we need to do a rethink in this in the city. I think this policy of the missing middle is going to have to be followed very closely with an analysis of how we're doing these things. Like our financial tools also need to follow and to fall within the policies that we're trying to get. Like if we're trying to get more missing middle around, transit, if we're trying to get more missing middle, our revenue tools, our development charges, and so on and so forth, land transfers, all this should go into that direction as well, because it creates an incentive and a disincentive to then do that 4,000 square feet home. So I do think that we need quite a bit of action in that space as well. We're doing a lot of studies in the built form, and I think Greg is really trying to prove that this will be a factor. The economics of the issue will be a factor as well, and I really believe we need to make that case inside City Hall as well, because it's been hard to make people understand that our financial tools need sometimes to also not only pay for things, but be in line with our policy. I think, for example, what we did with the vacant land transfer tax, right? It's the vacant homes tax. That is a tax that is very much driven to have a policy outcome. We want homes to be occupied instead of being empty. We need to start having that mind shift for some of these tools that we do around the missing middle to have more of it being built.
Thank you so much. And I just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to a question from Jacob. Jacob asked, what's next after the missing middle? Should we be rethinking a lot of design guidelines, such as angular planes, how we do secondary plans and transition zones? What's next?
Let's think big. I love to think big, and I think first of all, the code, the Ontario Building Code has a few things like the 2 staircases, and we're trying to change that. But if you really ask me what, and it's not, by the way, Jacob, my answer might surprise you because it's not at all related to city planning, but the fact that pre-construction sales is a huge problem because we sell it essentially everything to investors. And once you sell everything to investors, the end user is not part of the equation. And once the end user is not part of the equation, we build more units, not necessarily the right type of units. And this is all, and I was telling this to my friend, the same friend, the planner friend from my previous answer. And he said, whoa, this is a really big problem to tackle. And I said, yes, but that's probably, you just said that the yellow belt was another dream to tackle. So I think our system is a little bit, it's a really big problem that's called pre-construction sale, because just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page, this is how construction is being financed. You can't go to the bank and say, hey, can you give me money to build a 30-story building, or even 4-story, or even the fourplex. You can just knock on the bank door and ask for money. You need to show that you are able to finance it on your own. And the way it's being financed is by pre-construction sale. You buy everything, the unit on paper. You have no idea what you're buying. 5 years maybe down the road. And that's why the end user is not at all part of the story. So if you ask me what is my dream, my big dream next after the missing middle and zoning changes, I think that would be it. But again, I have a wish list of like the Ontario Building Code and annual plan. So I'm full of hopes.
My only short answer to Jacob's question is that it would probably be another James Walk panel to talk about some of his points. But the city just actually approved new changes for Danforth that move away from the angular plane approach. We actually have a transition zone approach, which is the area behind the mid-rise on the main street between the mid-rise and the avenue and the neighborhood. We did that on St. Clair. That was one of the first ones we did, actually, many, many years ago. And most of the mid-rise that you see on St. Clair has been built through the Committee of Adjustment, like as of right, with some tweaks to the zoning. And that's been a very under celebrated early approach that the city's taken. And I think these, as most policies are at the city, things are always under constant scrutiny, and we'll continue to be looking at these types of things.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Colleen's question. Asked really an interesting one. Currently, some neighborhoods like North York don't have much transit, and Missing Middle seems like an opportunity to increase transit routes and frequency. Is that part of the city's plan?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great point because I don't really buy into this slogan around the 15-minute city, but I think Pauline is raising this issue of access, greater access, and permeability and mobility across the entire city for more people. A lot of the disparity in this city and frankly, income and race segregation is around transit and access to transit. You could look at the history of the city and quite see how that disparity has grown over time. So bringing a transit network, a more robust transit network to greater parts of the geography is really fundamental. And then tying neighborhoods to the transit, whether through better pedestrian routes, better cycling, more walkability. I think they all fit together at the end in a much more equitable and inclusive approach to the way that you would design a city.
I think we really need to be looking at it's not just rapid transit. It's Toronto also has a lot of very good bus routes that have fairly high frequency. And the city needs to be way more aggressive about rapid TO. It's the idea that you have bus routes that have 30,000 plus people a day and you can't have bus lanes so people can park in front of their house is just absolutely absurd. And it's basically the city privileging rich people over a lot of disproportionately poor and racialized people. The city is perpetuating racial and class segregation with that, even though if you look at it, the bus lanes would make an enormous difference for a very large number of people, and the amount of people inconvenienced would be relatively small. And it's a case of they're like, yeah, but how am I supposed to get on? It's like, here is a TTC pass for the next 10 years. And those rapid TO routes, the city needs to be looking at improving transit, improving housing around those too. Because if you look at like Scarborough, even north of the 401, you still see huge transit ridership. A lot of people do use transit to get around.
Yeah.
It's still very convenient in a lot of places. You'll still have a bus running every 15 minutes at 2 o'clock in the morning.
And if we have more Missing Middle on those routes, they might even come quicker.
That's right.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds like everybody agrees on that question. Transit and Missing Middle go together very well. So we have one more question from Jacinta, which asks, how do you balance zoning changes and as of right building with new policies to provide growth like garden suites that still allow for privacy and also include affordable housing? Complex.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. I think it actually sums up the garden suites is just one example, but it really does sum up what we're trying to do with the Missing Middle. We still want high quality living environments for everybody, not only the new residents, but the existing residents. So we want good design. I think Noma's points about design driven solutions and creativity is so central to how to make all this work. And that means we can do this without planning against our urban canopy, our tree canopy. We still need to have trees in the city. We still need to have high quality living environments for everybody. And we have to balance those against and the need to increase our housing footprint. And we can do that in the space that we have very efficiently and economically. We don't have to sacrifice one for the other. Affordable is more about capital A affordable versus little a affordable. I think remembering the deputy mayor's comments about the fact that I don't think we're going to supply our way to affordability. We need an active role for the federal and provincial government and the municipal government. We've been leading investment in new affordable housing, but we need that to be sustained over a long period of time. So we make progress against our goals.
Shannon, I would just like to leave one point here because I think there's a lot of people probably watching us that are supportive of the missing middle, and some of them that are learning as well. And I want to hit on this point again, because I'm starting to hear some people coming out and saying, well, this missing middle stuff is no solution for everything, because it's not going to bring you the affordable housing. I've had sometimes these conversations in my own community, and all I keep saying is, yes, you're not going to get a garden suite built for less than $400,000 or $500,000, because that's really, there's not a nonprofit organization that could probably build you a unit in the city of Toronto for less than that, to be honest with you. That's just the cost of building. But that is still cheaper than the 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 million homes that people live in today. And I think we need to keep that in perspective. Yes, it's not going to create the housing for the person in ODSP, but it is going to create a much more affordable housing, maybe a first-year nurse, a first-year student, a first-year a planner that is coming out that needs and wants to live in some of these communities and should have the right to live in some of these communities. So I hope that for people that are out there, I really think we need to demystify these things. Yes, we're not talking about the deeply affordable, but it creates a level of affordability. And I think that there's going to be a strong forces trying to say we shouldn't look at this because it's not creating affordable housing, because $500,000 is not affordable housing. Well, if you take anything else, $500,000, even for a nonprofit, it's the cost of building a unit right now. So there's another conversation that needs to happen on that.
I've looked at this from a housing policy side, and what people forget is that if you don't build the housing for an upper middle class person, they're just going to buy something else, which means that is a unit that someone else couldn't get, which means that person's taking it from a unit that someone else couldn't get. And so what happens is, if you don't meet the demand at the upper end of the market, they will actually cascade down through the market. And at the bottom end of the market, people get pushed out into homelessness or need to double up in overcrowding. It's Helsinki did a study because they have detailed population registers. And what they found was, by building housing in the downtown for upper middle class people, because those people came from somewhere, they moved there, and then it freed up a unit, which freed up for someone else, who freed up for someone else, who freed up for someone else. And so even upper middle class housing actually created, it allowed a significant number of people from the bottom half of the market to move into nicer neighborhoods because of the housing it freed up. Because our population growth is governed from internationally and it's completely unlinked from the housing supply, if you don't build that housing, it's actually going to result in increasing escalating housing prices, which is exactly what we've seen. It's Toronto and Peel region have gigantic outflows of people, and we have now successfully destroyed the housing market in the entire province. And now the Maritimes is also just having its housing markets be completely obliterated. Because you have wealthy people from Toronto, it's like, wow, $500,000 for a single detached house on an acre. That sounds amazing. The actual market value of that was $400,000, and now that's priced in. The people who grew up there can't afford it. Mm-hmm. And if we don't build housing in Toronto, then people get pushed out. And in Brampton, because Brampton hasn't been able to keep up, now people are moving out to Dundalk. Yes, exactly. It's a game of musical chairs. And so people are moving to Dundalk, which is you take Highway 10 from the north of Brampton and drive 70 kilometers north. So we're actually creating gigantic ex-urban sprawl. And so Toronto's lack of building housing is destroying the climate too, in addition to making every other province in the country unaffordable.
Wow. Well, with that, it is a game of musical chairs, and we're seeing how it kind of tips the scales a little bit in that game greatly for other communities and other cities across Canada.
I'll just say one more word as the politician in the room and somebody that has come out and is supportive of this. Anybody listening to us out there, please have these conversations about missing middle in your circle of friends, with your families, in your communities. We need people to hear about this. We need people to understand this. We need the support for this. It is important that people understand that you're paying attention. And so I'll leave with that. Please have these conversations in the four corners of the city of Toronto, because we need everybody from Scarborough to Etobicoke, from North York to downtown Toronto, to understand the issue and be supportive of the issue.
Awesome. And there's nothing like our deputy mayor to leave us with a call to action. Thank you, everybody. It's been great hearing your perspectives, from your lived experience to your expertise and research analysis skills. Thank you so much for joining us on this Jane's Walk conversation about the missing middle. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their weekend. It's really sunny out there. Hope you get some time to take a walk because it's the Jane's Walk weekend. Take care.
Thank you.